would you just like to start things off by just explaining a little bit about what you do, where your expertise lie, and what your ideas are?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a philosopher at Macquarie University. I've been working there for about 5 years. And I do research on moral psychology, on ethics, on emotions, um, and I use digital humanities methods to support this research. I also have a kind of a side interest in the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher from the 19th century. And yeah, I've just been uh, pottering around doing my stuff for a while. I guess the reason you wanted to chat was some of the collaboration I've done with Oliver Curry and Mark Chung. So Oliver is trained as a psychologist. He's currently in the private sector um, at an NGO. Um, and Mark Chung is a computer scientist by training, but both of them have interest in philosophy. And in particular, Oliver really impressed me with presentation that he gave at a workshop in Ohio in, I think it was 2017, so quite a while ago. He had developed this idea of um, understanding morality as essentially whatever it is that supports cooperation. And he understands cooperation sort of technically using game theory. So the basic idea with game theory, as opposed to decision theory, is that choices are strategic. So in decision theory, what I choose determines what happens to me, and maybe there's some randomness, but that's all there is to it. Whereas with game theory, um, how things turn out for me depends not just on what I choose, but also on what other people choose. Um, and a sort of classic example of this comes from Rousseau, who wrote about what he called the stag hunt. We could call it a kangaroo hunt, since we're in Australia. And the basic idea with the stag hunt is, suppose you and I are both relatively good hunters. So each of us could independently go and just hunt rabbits, and we would succeed if we did so. But we could choose to team up, and one of us goes and scares the stag, the deer, to run down the trail, and the other is lying in wait and ambushes it. Um, that only works if both people play their part, right? So if you scare the stag and I've wandered off to hunt rabbits, then you're going to go hungry. Likewise, if I'm lying in wait to ambush the stag and you never scare it up, then then I'm just going to waste my time. So that's a kind of strategic interaction. And what Oliver has done is argued that we can understand morality as the set of um, evolutionarily stable strategies that support cooperation in non-zero sum games that we regularly encounter. So a non-zero sum game is one where if things go well for you, that doesn't mean that they go poorly for me. So there's a chance for like a win-win. Um, you succeed by helping me succeed. I succeed by helping you succeed. And the stag hunt is one example of that. The other six categories that Oliver identified include kin altruism. Um, Solidarity is basically what you get in the stag hunt. Reciprocity, so like you scratch my back, I scratch yours. There's also negative reciprocity where you hit me, I hit you back. Um, and then strategies related to conflict resolution. So it's really important that we find ways to resolve conflict without actually killing each other. And there are several strategies that help with this. You see them in the animal kingdom, in addition to humans. So, you sometimes see like goats butting heads against each other. They're basically testing, like, if we actually tried to kill each other, who would win? Um,
Mm.
and then the one who would win gets the resource or more of the resource that they're fighting over. And the one who would lose doesn't get killed.
Still gets to survive. Yeah.
Yeah. Recently, I was in the Blue Mountains and I saw this amazing display. There were two male lyrebirds. I don't know if you've encountered these. They,
I not I possibly, but not by I don't know them by name.
they're roughly the size of like a quail, and they're sort of famous for their ability to imitate any sound that they've ever heard. So you
Okay.
hear them singing like, babies crying, or a shoe slipping on a on the floor, or a chainsaw, or a
Wow. Any note.
kookaburra.
Whoa.
Yeah, they're really amazing. There
Wow.
were these two male lyrebirds who were disputing this mating ground. And the way that they resolved their dispute was by essentially singing at each other, to see who had the better song. Because if you had the better
What?
song, you were going to get the hen. So there's no point in coming to like pecking each other and trying to kill each other.
Isn't
Uh,
that essentially what humans do? Well, what males do when it's kind of out egoing each other and being the more masculine, where they haven't got to come to blows, but it's showing off these more masculine traits.
yeah, I think that's a kind of mating display, or not a mating display, but a dominance
Yeah, a
ritual.
game
Um,
ritual. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so so there's strategies like this that relate to being either a hawk or a dove, like either being more dominant or being less dominant, and they might look a bit ugly, but they're better than trying to kill each other. Um, so there, that's one additional pair of strategies. Another strategy is when there's a resource that's actually divisible, to just split it evenly. So fair division of resources is an evolutionarily stable strategy. And the final one that Oliver identified was respect for prior ownership. So like, don't cut the queue. Don't, get in line in front of someone if they're already there, or, if somebody's occupying some land, you don't just go and steal it from them. Um,
But is this predominantly human then? Because
uh,
my understanding being that these cooperative games that we play are only possible due to such a hyper-social world that we live in, where we are interpreting things way more than we used to, and we're living in large groups where these individual actions that we have could have severe consequences for us. Whereas it seems that dominance and almost like the Adam Smith kind of invisible hand, everyone going for themselves, will be the primary driver. But it's something we've now come to see as our neocortex has developed a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's analogs in non-human animals as well, which, is not that surprising given that they're our cousins. Um, we're especially good at it because we have these big brains, and because we have culture, and because we inherit norms from our parents and ancestors. Um, but you'll find these sorts of cooperation in lots of non-human animals. So like respect for prior ownership or occupation. Lots of animals are territorial. Um, and
Mm.
that's related to something like property. I mean, it's not quite the same thing as property, but um, it's a close analog. And things like kin altruism you find in basically all animals. Maybe not in certain ants or something, but even in ants, um, you'll find preference for the well-being of kin. So the idea is to sort of naturalize morality and make it part and parcel of our evolutionary development, which is not to say that it's all genetic. In fact, most of it is cultural, but it has to be consistent with the kinds of critters that we are.
Yes, yes, for sure. And I think it's. I was speaking with Dr. Kenneth Bloom the other day, who was a biologist who founded the gene which is responsible for our dopamine receptors in our brain. How many we have, and they said there's two variants of this gene. There's a He said it was a DRD2A1 and DRD2A2, and he found that this gene in particular can dictate your effectively dictates your likelihood to prefer something now versus something later.
Ah,
Whether you're more of a dominant type of person who goes for what they want now, or is quite happy to kind of play the long game and plan strategically for the future.
hmm,
And he described how there was an interplay between when these are more useful and sought after evolutionarily throughout human history, from back when we were in smaller societies and it was very dominance based games, versus the agricultural revolution. We had to think more about planning for the future, and that's led to different characteristics being sought after by females because of their perceived dominance and status within the group.
interesting. Yeah.
And so he was very much on the genetic side of things, where culture plays into it, but he believed that there was a baseline where you can obviously go so far one way and so far the other way, but your base amount is quite limited.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of this sort of famous experiment, the marshmallow experiment. I don't know if you've come across this.
Yes, yeah.
Uh, so the short version of it is, you take a little kid and you put them at a table and you put a marshmallow in front of them and you tell them, you can eat it now, but if you don't eat it now, and you wait for, I forget what it was, 5-10 minutes,
Mm.
then you get two marshmallows. Um, and there's if you go on YouTube, you can see videos of these kids like kind of staring at the marshmallow, like seeing how patient they can be. And some of them are more impulsive and they just go for it. Others, they wait a little bit, then they run out of patience. And still others, they wait and they actually do get the second marshmallow. Um, so there are individual differences in humans when it comes to sort of impulsiveness and um, willingness to just grab what's there. Um, and this makes sense. I mean, um, if you're in a society where you can't trust people, or if you're just in a high risk society or you're facing precarity, then going for the early reward that's smaller actually is a rational strategy. So you'd expect that, given that people have faced both surplus and scarcity, that some people would be a bit more inclined towards the impulsive decision and some would be more inclined towards patience.
Well, yeah, for definitely. And it's like the way he described it was that it's a much more of a primitive behavior, and it's a primitive gene. Once upon a time, we were almost entirely this A1 variant of this gene, because that was what society dictated. That's what it governed. That's what it was governed by. And that's where I feel a lot of the moral psychology was built within us. Children has a very ingrained idea of what is right and wrong and what is fair and what is not fair to them. And then you would suggest that game theory being a newer model, a newer way of thinking, which takes a lot more higher level functions of the brain, is what is developed later on. You're not now thinking about what's right ahead of you and what you want right now and what may be fair. You're thinking of the next move and the next move and the next move afterwards from there, which is
Yeah.
why
And
it's something
yeah,
that can be trained. And it's that I feel there's a big kind of one versus the other. 'Cause you can feel like, it seems like the moral psychology is something you can feel. You can feel that fairness, or when you're being treated improperly, or or not. And then the game theory would be like very stoic. Drop that completely. This is the long-term goal. This is what we're working towards, and we can even just plan that out beforehand and just skip to what we know.
Yeah, I and well, one thing I should say is that the the claim that Oliver makes is not that people actually necessarily run these calculations in their head and are um, themselves explicitly game theorists. It's rather that the strategies that a game theorist would recommend are the ones that people tend to adopt because they are successful. Um, so like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. I have a pet rabbit. Like, if I pet her on her head, then she'll lick my fingers. That's reciprocity, but she's not running
Yeah.
calculations in her head like, oh, okay, well, that was, a certain amount of benefit to me, and now I'd give a certain amount of benefit to you. It's just an instinct for her. Um, and I think with humans as well, a lot of it is just instinct or learned behavior where we don't really understand the reasons. It's not that we are actually doing the math,
Mm,
but the math is what underlies the fact that some strategies are successful, whereas others are less successful.
yeah. I did hear that the most successful long-term strategy was tit for tat. Into purely long-term strategy games. I don't tit for tat, is it called the same here? Are you aware of that one?
Yeah, that's interesting. So,
I don't know if that's correct or not. This is what I heard was not for direct results dependent, but in long-term survival strategies, tit for tat
yeah,
is the most
um,
effective.
it's complicated. So tit for tat is a very good strategy, um, but actually, one tit for two tats is sometimes even better. So the idea with tit for tat is like, I start out just being trying to cooperate, and as long as you keep cooperating, then I keep cooperating. And if you turn on me, if you betray me, then I will stop cooperating. But if you start cooperating again, then I start cooperating again. So
Mm,
it's basically mimic um, the most recent move um, of your potential cooperation partner. That works really well in a situation where um, people are going to keep interacting with the same individuals and remember who's who. Um, and it also works well in situations where there's sort of perfect information. So
mm,
one thing that might happen is like, suppose we agree to meet up for coffee, and I just forget it. Like I didn't put it in my calendar. I put it in for the wrong day or the wrong place, and I don't show up. Right now, I've wronged you.
mm.
Now, if you're playing tit for tat, you just say like, okay, well, screw that guy. Um,
Yeah,
and
you'd never get back to there'd never be a chance to reconvene and
Yeah, exactly.
carry on.
So a different strategy that's sort of more forgiving is like, I try to cooperate a couple of times, and if you betray me several times in a row, then I stop cooperating. But
Mm,
I've got a little bit of leeway. Um, and that is a strategy that is more successful in situations where people just sometimes make random mistakes.
yeah.
Um, it's not a successful strategy when people are always trying to take advantage of you. So it really depends on the strategic environment. There's no one strategy that works in every environment, but tit for tat is in general is a pretty good one.
It kind of feels like in today's hypersocial world that those who are able to be the most or those who are the most financially successful, not say successful on the whole, that's a different philosophical debate. But those who are the most financially successful are those who are able to forego those moral feelings of injustice on a personal small scale in favor of the large scale benefit. Where I can't remember what the scale was, but I know there's different scales and ratings within personality traits. And if you look, I can't remember what the exact one is. It's going to bug me now. But if you look at the scores of these traits within some of the world's most successful philanthropists and billionaires, like your Bill Gates or Elon Musk's or Donald Trump's or whoever, those people on a very personal level can be quite cold and don't have that same kind of moral compass one to one and don't care as much effectively for individuals. But the argument is that they do care, but on a larger scale and are quite happy with doing wrong by a few people in favor of the masses, which seems a lot more of a higher function ability than what most people around the world, you'd argue, is find it very hard to do that to somebody individually for a greater gain because it doesn't feel right.
Hmm. Well, I'm not sure about Musk and Trump right now, but Bill Gates does seem
On the
to,
As examples, shall we say?
yeah. I mean, the amount of good he's done eradicating malaria is pretty impressive. So we can stick with that example if you don't mind. Um, I think one important thing to note in that context is that um, when you have a lot of resources, you can take more risks. Um, if
Hmm.
you're living on the knife's edge and any mistake is going to cost you your life or your prosperity or your connections, then you need to be really risk averse. Whereas when you have a lot of resources, you can sort of diversify your investments and expect that some of them are going to fail, but enough of them will succeed that you'll be all right. Um,
Mm.
I think this relates to what you're saying, which is that um, people who are at least financially successful often are willing to take certain kinds of social risks that other people find um, too difficult.
So it's like they can justify their actions to an individual, or let's say they are, because like me or you or somebody else who's quite social in their own communities and environments, you'd take part in the sort of the secret Santas, you go to birthdays, weddings, and you're in that social world, and that's like there's a reciprocity there, and it's a comforting feeling, and you're doing nice things for other people on a small scale.
Yeah.
Whereas people who often are the most financially successful, and you could argue in some ways have the most impact of gain for the whole society, forego those interpersonal connections one to one in favor of what they may justify as a greater good, which a lot of people I feel struggle to do on a moral standpoint because of those feelings that causes. Let's say I've got my girlfriend, and let's say I wanted to work night and day on a business venture which could help millions of people, but then I may forego time giving her giving her what she needs from me. I may not be
Yeah.
willing to do that, but somebody else may be willing to do that. And it almost seems like I don't know whether it's a genetic thing or whether it is a cultural thing, but there's certain people, maybe it's that 80-20, who aren't as biased or as fussed by the moral, psychological values that a lot of society has.
Um, y- yeah, I mean, and it's good to have diversity in the population. So it's good that there are people who get very attached to their family and a few close friends. Um, that creates social bonds that are really valuable. It's also good that there are people who um, are a bit more detached and think more big picture. It's ve- it's very often lonely for them. So it's not necessarily an enviable position.
Oh, of
Um,
course, I wouldn't want it.
uh, but I think it's in general good that we have a certain amount of psychological diversity in the population.
What would, from your obviously your experience as a philosopher and looking into historical philosophy, what would some major philosophers say on these kind of matters now? Because I have a sense now where it's because obviously we're not there, we don't know the culture and society, the ins and outs of what it was actually like. We only have the history books. I find it. I sometimes believe that within a lot of classical philosophy, it's telling people what they want to hear in a way where influencers do that now, and they were the influencers of the day, and those are the ones who got that popularity. And is there truth to it? Is there a like a yeah? Is it more? Does it seem more facts based, or is it just kind of a bias towards historical evidence?
Um, I mean, sort of famously, Socrates was not very popular. They put him to
Yeah.
death. So, uh, philosophers have often had a sort of contentious relationship with their own societies because they turn, not all of them, but some of them, many of them turn a critical eye on their in group. Um, Socrates sort of most famously, uh, I think I mentioned earlier that I work on Nietzsche. Um, he argues for the value of what he calls solitude. In German, it's Einsamkeit, um, and it's basically a disposition um, to look at and criticize the worst things about your own culture. Um, he left Germany, went to live in Switzerland and Italy. And if you read his writings, he's like constantly saying nasty things about the Germans. And you might think that's just like sour grapes or something, but I think there's something more to it, which is it's very easy to get kind of cozy in your in group in the culture in which you're raised, um, and to fail to see the flaws that it has. And of course, every culture has flaws. Um, so this kind of Einsamkeit, this solitude, is a way of sort of forcing yourself to look at the flaws of your own group and to try to improve things. Um, did Nietzsche actually succeed in improving the Germans? Well, it's not clear. I mean, they went and became Nazis after he died, so he may have failed, but he was just trying to do his part.
So, do you obviously you've found a lot of interest within Nietzsche? Is that something that you were kind of leaning towards as more prevalent within human nature? Because I'm from Britain, and that's something we're very good at is criticizing ourselves more than anyone else. Whether it works or not, we don't know. But it's does it build a certain kind of culture which is net good, net positive? Because just playing the devil's advocate, I could see a way in which being disposed to criticizing your own culture and criticizing your own decisions could, in essence, I could see lead to a culture of dominance and a culture of people being scared to step out of line and people just following the status quo. And also,
Hmm.
we already spoke briefly of how having that diversity is important, but for the general well-being and feelings of the overall society, would that be a good thing? As opposed to, let's say, on the flip side, as you may have the Americans when they just split off and it's the American dream was prevalent. That was where everyone wanted to go. He was highly motivated. They're massively just bigging themselves up constantly as the opposite.
Uh, Interesting. I mean, so in in my book that came out this year on Nietzsche, I point out that he likes to invoke this myth of Procrustes. Um, for your viewers who are not familiar with this, it's a ancient Greek myth Procrustes was this guy who would invite you to his home, uh, tell you, "Oh, you can sleep in this bed," and then in the night he would come and see whether you were too long for the bed or too short for the bed. And if you were too short, he would stretch you out to make you fit the bed. And if you were too long, he would cut off your feet to make you fit the bed. Um, and Nietzsche complains about what he calls Procrustean moralization, um, which is a way of sort of forcing everybody to be the same in ways that are damaging or violent. Um, and this is one of the reasons why he values diversity so much. He thinks that it's wrong to um, force this kind of Procrustean morality onto people. You need to recognize that they're individuals, that they have their own values and preferences and predilections. Um, and when he exercises this virtue of solitude, one of the things he criticizes in his contemporary German culture is this tendency to force everyone to be the same. Um, Immanuel Kant sort of famously argued for what he called the categorical imperative, which is a moral rule that everyone always should follow no matter what. So that's very Procrustean.
Mm.
Um, I can't speak to the British context. I mean, I've visited your islands several times, but I'm familiar with like this problem of being a tall poppy, where if you
Yeah.
stand out, then you get cut down. That's sort of Procrustean as well. I guess that terminology is used here in Australia as well, given the British heritage. So I'm not sure whether the United States is really an exemplar right now, but there's a bit less of that there. We've got our own problems of arrogance and sense of superiority. Um, so it's not like uh, there's one right way to do it. But it's important to be able to turn a critical eye on one's heritage and culture.
Yeah. I wasn't to saying I wasn't to say that they were doing it right by any stretch. I think that's quite evident. But it's as a case of being one way of looking at it versus another. It almost seems to me at times that because you can choose one way or the other way and be just as successful or unsuccessful regardless, that the strictness at which certain philosophers abide by their own thoughts and internal rulings can seem almost problematic to some degree.
Yeah, I think that's right. Recognizing that you could be wrong is a really important part of um, philosophical training. Socrates, um, for instance, was sort of famous for saying that the only thing that he knew was that he knew nothing. Um, and when somebody becomes sort of dogmatic and they're absolutely certain, then you can be pretty sure that they're wrong.
Yeah, yeah. I like how a lot of philosophers, I feel they when they come to those kind of conclusions, it almost seems very Taoist in a sense. So
Um, can you tell me what you mean by that?
so Taoist and Wu Wei in the Asian philosophies being you you do by doing nothing in a sense. So there's a in I don't know if you read the Tao Te Ching.
Hmm.
Yeah. So in that sense that it's almost like a very Asian philosophy where you do one thing and it'll cause the other one, and in a sense you are just creating an action, and our human nature is to see positives and negatives, the flip sides of things, and that is what we'll create because we are great at deciphering and contrasting one thing to another. Wherein their argument would be, in a way to live in accordance with nature, would be to essentially leave it alone. and just be, and not to make those incisions within reality. Don't make an
Yeah.
incision
So,
because all you're doing is splitting it into two sides, that yin and yang, where once you've done that, you create black and white out of what is the same, and essentially you then start to play the game of, oh, what if black wins, or what if white wins, and we have to do something about it, and that causes that sine-like wave of economic action, in a sense.
hmm. My familiarity with this stuff is from primarily from uh, Ted Slingerland, who's a sinologist in Canada. He's got this really cool book called "Trying Not to Try,"
Yeah.
uh, which is a way of interpreting this notion of wu wei. So the basic idea, at least as I understand it from him, is that um, there's a certain kind of charisma that comes with what seems like effortless uh, action. So if you look like you're trying too hard, then people are not going to trust you.
Mm,
But if it looks like this is just what comes naturally, then that inspires trust. Um, but this creates a kind of paradox because if you want to be the sort of person who inspires that trust, then you might try to do it, but then you are going to be the sort of person who's clearly trying too hard. Um, and different Asian philosophers address this in different ways. So, one, you mentioned the Dao Jing. There's also the tradition that comes from Confucius, where first you do really try way too hard, and you sort of discipline yourself. But then once that discipline is acquired, things come naturally to you, and
mm,
you don't need to continue with the discipline. Another tradition that comes from Mengzi um, refers to virtues as sprouts. So basically, the idea is like just plant them in the ground, and you water them a little bit, you give them a little bit of fertilizer, but basically you just let them do their thing. He offers this metaphor at one point and talks about a farmer who's like trying to get his crops to grow more quickly, and does this by like pulling at them, um, and he ends up pulling them out of the ground and killing them. So
mm,
the idea there is like he's trying too hard, and then that ruins it. So yeah, I think there's something to this. Actually, Nietzsche has a sort of sprout metaphor as well. It's not clear to me whether he came up with it independently or he somehow was familiar with Chinese philosophy. He definitely didn't read Chinese. So my guess is that it just sort of occurred to him. But it could have been passed through multiple layers of testimony as well. So not entirely clear.
mm. So because I've always been interested by the commonalities and stark differences between Western and Eastern philosophies, and how they interplay with our actual society.
Hmm.
Because it very much seems like a lot of the time that the Western side being that top-down authoritarian view on things, and the things that we are pushed and are pushed towards us from such a young age are very logistical, logical, and to incite order in as much way as possible. And that's something I feel that comes with its own issues, where it's the you see a lot more in Western societies than Eastern societies and cultures, that there is a general underlying displeasure and discontentment with day-to-day life in a lot of these Western cultures.
That's interesting. I mean, my understanding is that you find both of these both in the East and the West. So, like in China, the Moist tradition is very um, involved with law and sort of top down rule. the Confucian
Mhm.
tradition is very uh, interested in rituals and propriety, um, whereas like Mengzi and Zhuangzi are more sort of like loosey goosey. And then, if you look in the West as well, you can find people like Immanuel Kant, who apparently was so ordered that people would set their clocks based on when he was taking a walk, because he would always take a walk at the same time of day, every day.
Yes, and he had his house, didn't he? And he did his writing and his walks at the exact same time for his, like, 30 or 40 years
Yeah,
straight. Was it
yeah,
something like that? It's the
yeah. So
exact same order.
yeah, so you got people like that, but then you've also got people like David Hume, who, in in his work, he is pretty breezy, and he even remarks at one point like, I say all this stuff about philosophy, but then I just go to the pub and have a drink. So I think you find the same differences in the East and the West, maybe expressed slightly differently, but you know w- we're all the same species. We're all pretty diverse. So it would not be surprising that you see sort of the same disagreements or the same differences crop up in different places.
It does seem to be from through my own personal experience that it's as there are things that are more troubling in my life or things that need addressing, whether that be physically, health-wise, financially, location, socially, whatever it might be, then at those moments, the more top-down view on things and getting a handle and order seem to be a lot more enticing to me, as
Mm,
opposed to when I've figured those things out and things seem to be very stable and when the things seem to be very stable and at a good level, I then seem more enticed by the more bottom up, loosey goosey, as you'd say, more style of philosophy and living until when the eye's off the ball again, because I've not been focusing and I haven't had that discipline to look at my own life and the things that are happening with a fine tooth comb. That kind of order falls away over time, and those habits creep in to where it kind of keeps going back and forth throughout
mm,
that, and
mm,
isn't as stable as I'd like.
mm.
And I feel that's kind of prevalent with people are in their 20s, especially.
I've been there.
So I find it interesting to see that. What would your work through game theory say about this? Because this is where I'm wanted to speak to you more so about is that we could talk about the philosophies of different philosophies being prevalent and what they mean. But is there any almost mathematical proof behind why we look at certain philosophies and why they may work within an evolutionary standpoint?
Um, I'm not quite sure I can answer the question, but let me try. Um, so one thing that I've argued in a recent paper is that um, there are certain virtues and vices that need to be distributed across a population or across a lifetime. Um, so let's start with the population. So being spiteful is generally kind of a bad thing. Um, but if you've got a few spiteful people in your community and they're really strict at enforcing norms, then that can actually make the norms um, make it more likely that people actually abide by the rules and do well by each other. That doesn't mean that the spiteful people uh, enjoy doing what they're doing. They're probably angry all the time, um, and it probably loses them friends. So it makes
Mhm.
their lives worse. But the society as a whole is better off for having them around. Not too many of them. You don't need a lot of them, just a few. But that that can actually sort of stabilize the society. if you turn instead to the individual and think about their lifespan, the same sort of thing might apply. So it might be that like it's good to generally be trusting, but occasionally be spiteful, because sometimes you need to sort of lay down the law and make it clear that people are not welcome to take advantage of you. But if you're
Mm.
spiteful all the time, you're going to be miserable. But
It almost
likewise,
seems that is sorry to interrupt, but that just agreeing with what you're saying there, it almost does feel that you are wired that way anyway, where it's not just it's a random case of this might happen or this might happen, but there is a genuine feeling of bottling something up which needs to come out in some way or another. It's almost like we're wired to have that in us because that makes sense and that is a survival technique or strategy or yeah.
yeah, and it's not necessarily something that you know we think about and plan out over the course of decades. It's just something that happens, uh, either because of our biological heritage or because of our enculturation or individual learning, some combination of the three. Um, but that kind of diversity within a lifespan is also, in many cases, valuable. I mean, obviously, if you're too spiteful, you're just going to have a bad life. Um, and if you're too gullible and trusting of everyone always all the time, you're going to have a bad life. So there needs to be some kind of um, middle ground there. And that's sort of what all the philosophers are trying to figure out. And we've been at it
Mm.
for a few millennia. We haven't quite figured it out, but we're trying.
Is there any evidence to suggest that this is something that happens systematically throughout the aging process or a human's lifetime? Or is it primarily through the culture and society that they find themselves in, where and when they will have these, say, bouts of spitefulness or bouts of generosity or periods of time where they may be inclined towards one way of acting versus another? Because it's often, especially being in my 20s at the moment, it's you can feel a shift from one way of going about your life to another. And it's interesting to me to find out whether or not that is something that just happens as our genes express themselves throughout our lives and will change almost in a way that can be, you can see it coming, versus right now I am in this situation. This explains exactly why I'm acting the way that I'm acting.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of work in developmental psychology that speaks to this. Clearly, there are huge changes that occur in the first, let's say, 15 years of life, right? So, initially you can't speak, you can't hold your head up, um, you can't walk. Um, slowly, uh, if you are lucky enough to have, you know, decent parentage, then you develop all these things, um, and then you go through puberty, and your brain is not fully myelinated until the age of 26, right? So, like, there are certain things that are sort of hardwired, um, that take several decades. Um, there are other things that are much more path dependent. So, like, kids who experience childhood trauma, in many cases, they can't come back from that. Um, it's sort of a one-way street. Um, whereas kids who have good parentage, they might end up going one direction or another. Um, and then with the process of aging, also accumulation of wealth and social networks, um, you see all kinds of changes. Some of them predictable, some of them not. Um, Gerard Saussure, who's a psychologist at the University of Oregon, has done some really interesting work on decade long data sets of personality over time. And he tends to find that uh, people become more open-minded, more extroverted, less neurotic, um, more agreeable um, over the course of their lifetimes. And that could be because of biology. That could be because once you get kind of settled in uh, a comfortable life, I mean, he's mostly studying Americans and Canadians. Um, if you get settled in a comfortable life, it's easier to be more agreeable and open because you're
Mm.
not under risk.
Well,
If
to me, evolutionary, that makes a lot of sense. Whereas when you were younger, you've got a social pass from a lot of the older members of the community and of the society because you're given that leeway of okay, you're young, you haven't learned, you might get a slap on the wrist, and you'll learn from that. But then as you come into that your prevalent years up until you were say 26, 27, 28, where you are more or less at your physical peak traditionally, it seems like you can be more aggressive. You can be more physically demanding and dominant within from an evolutionary standpoint, because that's what's going to dictate your status and mates ongoing from there. And then as you get to those later ages of 30, 40, 50, if you make it, and especially evolutionarily, you haven't got that physical prevalence anymore. And you need to really think about that game. Which game are you playing? Because you can't dominate somebody physically anymore. You want to stay on their good side. So you will be possibly more open and agreeable and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, but there's also the fact that like dominance works in lots of ways, and individually dominating one person is actually a really dumb strategy.
Oh,
Um,
for humans now, of course. I mean, I was thinking more if you look back at, say, of pre-human times, which is more or less, well, the vast majority of our brain's wiring.
yeah, I mean, we've been coalition builders for about a million years. Um, it, it, so you may have come across this theory of human self-domestication. Um, Domestic critters are really interesting. So think about like dogs, rabbits, cats, cows. Um, they're strange animals. They are much less afraid of each other and of humans than wild animals. They are much less violent. They are very gregarious. They like to cuddle and stuff, um, which you don't see as much in wild animals. And humans also have this trait, which is interesting because the theory for like how dogs got domesticated was basically there were human groups and there were wolves that would hang around near them. And the more aggressive wolves would get killed because they're scary. And so through evolutionary pressure exerted by humans, not intending to domesticate, but just protecting themselves, you end up with these cuddly dogs that are our our friends.
Very
Um,
rapidly as well.
yeah, pretty quickly. If you call the aggressive males really aggressive, like get rid of them, it happens quite quickly. There was an experiment with foxes in Siberia in the 20th century where this Russian guy showed that you could essentially domesticate foxes in just a few decades.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there was an illegal experiment in America. At some I can't remember where it was, how long ago it was, but they were did it with dogs where they were selecting for certain traits, to physical traits like
mhm.
longer tails, longer ears, something like that. And it only took them within 10 generations of highly specific self-selecting for their own personal unethical in a sense um, experimentation, and they
Yeah.
were able to do it very quickly.
Yeah. So the self domestication hypothesis is that um, when young men got too aggro, they would just be killed or left behind. Um,
Mm.
and this is why we're such soft, cuddly primates. Because that kind of trait was mostly selected out, not because people were trying to engage in eugenics or something, because they didn't understand anything about genetics, but just because that's what happens when you don't allow the most aggressive males to reproduce anymore. Um,
That's
so
where there's like a dilemma, isn't there, though, there with that?
how's that?
So I read a great book a couple months ago now, um, called Darwin Economics.
Okay.
So that argued that using effectively along the lines of game theory within mathematics within evolution, that that we as populations. So I'll use the example, and the example used in the book was populations of foxes and rabbits,
Hmm.
being that over time, if there's less foxes, more rabbits will reproduce, and therefore, because there's more rabbits, there's more food source for the foxes, and then they will go up, and the populations would kind of go up and down, and they'd never stabilize. They'd just constantly be moving back and forth. And then that went further on to say, within humans and different traits, is that self domestication works to an extent. However, we are still evolutionarily wired to be sought after so a lot of these more masculine traits. And throughout evolution, not so much now because it doesn't work, but that 20% of men reproducing with 80% of the women, being that if all these women are after just 20% of the men, and that what they are more sought after, or they are more looking for on an attraction basis, is that more masculine traits, that you'd argue that because it's been self-selected down and down, that these people are the ones that are spreading on their genes more so. And that'll kind of come up and down throughout history and throughout humankind.
Yeah. I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean by masculine traits. So, like, one very effective way to attract a mate is to be generous. Um, it sounds like you're more thinking of it like aggression and dominance, um, which can also sometimes be a successful strategy, but can also be incredibly off-putting. Um, so, uh, I mean, I guess this is related to the puzzle of psychopathy. So in the current population, approximately 2% of men and 0.1% of women are psychopaths, meaning that they are able to turn off their empathy and sympathy and exercise either aggressive or humiliating motives towards other people without any kind of sense of guilt or conscience. Um, and one hypothesis as to why these people exist in the first place is that um, that can, if it in certain circumstances, actually be a successful um, strategy. If you have too many psychopaths in your population, then you just go to war, civil war, and everything falls apart. Um, but if you
So,
have a mostly peaceful society and a few of these folks around, they
mm,
might actually be able to take advantage of others and succeed.
so
And
this
they're
is where the Darwin economics comes into play, where over the past however many generations, it's clear that, as you say, in that self-selection of those traits, leading to a lot more generous and kind and reciprocal world that we are in now. Comparing this even to, say, 100 years ago when we had world wars and violence was everywhere and it was a lot more of a physical, violent world to live in. But because the Darwin economics would say that now we are at a quite a high level of generosity and what is traditionally seen as more feminine traits within our society, which would then lead to a lot more of these negative traits being able to rise. Let's say, like for in Australia at the moment in Sydney, homelessness is a massive issue where it's rising and rising and rising. Where instead of having that cutthroat mentality of we need to get rid of these people because they're not good for society, it is a society that is cultured and self-selected for generosity and equal rights for everybody, which is now allowing those populations of people to grow and become more of a problem because it's because of that. And it's that argument that it comes back and forth, and that's almost like a natural cascading of events through evolution, almost as a river would ebb and flow one way to one side to another. That's a similar thing that may be happening with genetics in humans and for animals. That makes
Yeah,
sense. I
I
don't know if I've
mean,
explained that too well.
well, so you're not going to see anything like biological evolution in humans in one century. Um,
But
that's
culture,
just like three
society,
or four
nature, yeah.
and yeah, that's like four generations. So um, even if you have very strong selective pressure, you're not going to see biological evolution at that scale. On the other hand, in the last 100 years, human life expectancy has doubled, which is
Mm.
astonishing, right? You don't see that in other species, right? If all of a sudden, like the cats were living to the age of 40, 45, um, we really kind of astonished. So there clearly have been a lot of really huge cultural changes in the human population in the last century. Most of them driven by technology, um, uh, things like public health measures, vaccines, um, nutrition. Um, I lived for 5 years in the Netherlands. A century ago, they were the shortest people in Europe. Now they're the tallest people in Europe. Um, that's not
So
a
in a
matter of
hundred years,
biological evolution. Sorry.
in 100 years, that's how fast things can change quite dramatically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, really, really quick. But that was had essentially nothing to do with genetics. It was a matter of sanitation and nutrition, and stuff like that. Um, so I guess I want to push back a little bit and say, yeah, there of course we're biological critters and our genetics matter, but a lot of the changes that we've seen, especially recently, have essentially nothing to do with our biology.
Mm. This is where I'm interested in trying to find where all these different elements and perspectives of looking at the same thing align as much as possible. Because I've always got that idea of okay, biology's genetics is got a lot more to play than a lot of people believe. I've got the other side of things and thinking that is there a philosophical argument for these kind of things and why and what the purpose may be, and then evolutionarily as well. I would love to try and get to some sort of alignment and say, okay, these all make sense from different perspectives, which is why the philosophical argument, I personally believe that it's that philosophy itself is a manifestation of just how we have evolved and how we have our own biologies and instincts, and it's just the words that we put to it, and why it's so attractive to so many people is because when it's worded so well, it strikes a chord because that's what because we all find it so hard to put across.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to the people who specialize in philosophy of biology and um, uh, anthropology and primatology, they'll tell you that humans are genetically very uninteresting. We don't actually have all that much difference from each other. Um, so there's basically three human populations because humans started in sub-Saharan Africa, and then one group migrated to what's now the Middle East and Europe, and then another group did that much later, and then there was the group that stayed behind. And you see the most diversity in the group that stayed behind. So if you're interested in human genetic diversity, you need to go to the the savannah, basically. That's where you find it, because essentially everyone who descended from the folks who migrated out is very, very, very similar to each other. Um, there's some of us who have Denisovan DNA uh, and various other human cousins, but we're really similar to each other. That's because the groups that migrated out at various points suffered tremendously, and the best estimate is that at one point there was only like 2,000 individuals alive. So you don't have a lot of genetic diversity if there's only 2,000 people. And then, we exploded onto all the continents except Antarctica. But we're actually extremely similar to each other in a way that, biologists find sort of boring, because compared to other
Mm,
species, we we're very homogeneous.
okay. Because I'm trying to figure out whether or not a lot of these psychological and moral differences that so many of us have can be, in some regard, explained genetically. It's seeming that that may not be the case as much as to as much as I believed it may have been able to be. So if that's not the case,
I mean, we're Yeah, so you might want to have a look at this book by Kim Sterelny. He's a philosopher at ANU. It's called The Pleistocene Contract. And he argues that, he essentially argues that three of the seven elements of morality that Oliver Curry talks about are deeply imbued in our genes, and the others are all basically cultural. So he thinks you start out with kin altruism. So, like, looking after your kids and your cousins and your siblings and
mm,
your parents, like, that's really, really deep. Um, that's clearly something that's genetically programmed. Now, who exactly counts as kin is an interesting question. So, like, is it only your kids, or is it your cousins? Is it your second cousins? Is it your cousins by marriage? So who's in the family is culturally determined, but there's some notion of familyhood that is clearly genetically programmed. Um, Kim also argues that reciprocity is really deep in the genes, and that makes sense to me as well. I mean, I mentioned my rabbit, right? It's an instinct for her. If I pet her, then she will lick my finger. Like, it's just how it goes. I didn't need to teach her that.
mm,
Um, so you got those two, and then he argues that the third one is a kind of solidarity with that he hypothesizes arose initially among women, and had to do with childbirth and child rearing. So, giving birth on your own is really dangerous. Uh, but if you've got a kind of sisterhood who look after each other and take turns looking after each other when they are pregnant, um, then, well, it still is pretty dangerous, but it's not as dangerous. Um, and he suggests that solidarity sort of started there, and then people were like, "Oh, that's a really good strategy. I'm going to adopt that as well." So the ladies figured it out first, and then the men were like, "Oh, we could do that too." Not with childbirth, but with other kinds of solidarity. And then all the other stuff, like respect for property, gets built on top of that later, through institutions and norms and reasoning and talking to people um, uh, and stuff like that. That's the claim, at least in his book. I find it
mm.
pretty persuasive, but you'd have to give it a look yourself to see what you think.
Definitely. What was his name again? Sorry.
Kim It's a
Ki-
Kim Storelny.
Kim
I'll put it in the
Star.
chat.
Yeah, please do. I'll have definitely search it up later because I just see different ways of looking at things, and I want to try and see where they marry up or where they agree with each other more than where they disagree with each other. There's two great books I'd refer to on this similar topic would be one by Matt Ridley called The Rational Optimist. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that one being effectively an economics book, but it goes as far as explaining
Mhm.
a lot of society and how just keeps progressing and propelling itself forward exponentially, coming down to that reciprocity and creating new things and specializing within that solidarity, having that solidarity to specialize as well, and that being something that seems very innate within humans, which others don't have. Then other books which make very compelling arguments, such as The Status Game by Will Storr. If you've read that one.
I have not come across that one.
So he has a very different way of looking at things, which seems almost even evolutionarily in psychology and within our genes and genetics in our brain is potentially even more ancient than the reciprocity. And that his arguments are that so many things come down to status. Not just status as in ego and bravado, but he argues there's three different types of status. So in three different status games that we play. Let me search them up now. Three types of status game. So one of them being sort of the dominance game, another one being the virtue game, and the other one being the success game. And the better we become at playing those games and the interplay between them, the more status that we will have relatively within our groups, which is the higher our status, the more likely we are to pass on our genes effectively. And these games are really, really ingrained within us, and which is almost like the Lord of the Flies kind of mentality. It happens within kids way more than you see it within adults when that kind of neocortex kicks in, and we start to become more open and agreeable to things, and more of a beneficial member of the society on the whole. And he went as far as explaining why Hitler did the things that he did because of the games that he was playing. And when you look at it from purely from status and you take the context and the philosophical arguments of good versus bad out of it, it made complete sense. I'm not smart enough. I'm going to butcher his words and try and explain that because I feel like that's social suicide. But he makes a very good, compelling argument as to understanding why his brain thought that it was a good idea at the time. Because there's a great article called the perils of audience capture, which go alongside.
Mm.
Have you heard of the article? Have you read it? But it's so the
I
article.
know this concept, audience capture.
Yes, and that's from a status point of view. The makes perfect sense where we build our identities off of what gives us the most status. And you forget about logical reasoning or both sides because you're getting such a status boost personally from this constant feedback that you double down on those certain areas. And that seems very different to that reciprocal benefit that you see on a larger scale throughout communities and societies. And it's how I see that humans in particular, for the it's that interplay between that sort of Adam Smith invisible hand versus so everyone doing their own bit for the society and having that diversity versus everybody doing what should be done for the overall community. So I'm just trying to see where they line up more than anything from a philosophical standpoint, from a evolutionary, scientific, and mathematical standpoint, and at what stage we may be now, especially in the Western world.
Yeah, okay. There's a lot there.
Yes, sorry.
Um, uh, no, I'm just trying to think. So, if you approach it historically, I think it's really important to focus on the agricultural revolution. I
Hmm.
know this might sound like it's coming out of nowhere,
No,
um,
definitely in line with Matt
but
Ridley's work.
okay. Um, so before the agricultural revolution, human societies were relatively equal. Um, and that's because you can't really dominate someone or put them under your thumb for very long in a small band hunter gatherer society or even a pastoralist society. Um, because if you're going to go hunting mastodons with someone, then you need to give them a spear. Well, now they have a spear. If they don't like you, they might stab you with it.
Well,
Um,
I feel like the
so
just to just to interject a little bit, I'm sorry, I feel like that's understandably, yes, from a physical standpoint of you can't dominate someone or hold them under your thumb, yes. But more so in line with what you were saying with the Rams, where their game was they're butting heads to see who would win if it came to it.
yeah,
And that's those status games being who would be the dominator if it were to come to that.
yeah. So you would still have some difference, but the differences would be relatively small. It's once you get um, agriculture that you can put people in the fields and maybe you give them a plow, but it's really hard to kill someone with a plow. Whereas the overlords are, standing there with their spears and their swords and forcing people to work. Um, so that's when you get this stark pyramid emerging in human societies. Best estimate is that during the agricultural revolution, only 1 out of every 10 males managed to have offspring. Um, so you got this massive concentration of reproductive um, capacity in a very small portion of the population. Um, so that's a case where this kind of status stuff would kick in. Because if you're the big boss or if you're the king, right, then you have very high reproductive capacity. Whereas if you're a slave working in the fields, you're a dead end.
Mm.
Um, there's been quite a lot of pushback against that, of course, and things swing back and forth. With revolutions and stuff. So I don't think I disagree at all about any of this stuff about status, but as you mentioned, one of the games is the virtue game, right? So coming across and actually being generous um, is a way to acquire status as well. And that's very different from, rams butting heads to see who would kill the other one. Um, I think a lot of it depends on the mode of economic organization, and a lot of it depends on technology, and a lot of it is just very contingent. It sort of depends on what happened most recently.
Because it seems to me, at least, that there is a threshold that we're crossing now where that mentality or that way of life that you're saying, where at best estimates it was 1 in 10 males got to pass on their genes. That obviously is very in line with what
Yeah.
Dr. Kenneth Bloom was talking about with the two at the agricultural time, that being as well. Um, sorry, as the agricultural revolution was taking place, and that made a lot of sense with the massive explosion of that DRD2A2 gene coming into play, because these people who had these farms and had these mentalities were the ones who were more forward, more thinking about the future and longevity with that. However, it seems to me that we were a lot more impulsive for so much longer than we have ever been not impulsive. And those are so ingrained in us from a psychological point of view. And I understand you're saying that about 1 million years ago we were becoming more domesticated and societally inclined. But it's a case of those things are still at play now. However, society as we know it has, to my understanding, has only propped up with the fact that we mate 1 to 1 and have long pair bonds which prop up our economical society. Because without that, it would quite possibly just descend into that more of a violent time that we had previously. which is
Yeah,
seems
let's
to
hope it
be
doesn't come to
evidence
that.
within. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. And it's philosophically, I'd want to say that it's people nowadays, because they haven't got to worry about imminent death over the next few days or couple weeks, because times aren't like that anymore. You'd argue that people would have their own kind of
Well,
philosophical
if you're in
revolution.
Ukraine or Gaza, it might disagree.
Of course. But that being, as we have solved a lot of these primitive issues that we had previously, survival issues, now we've come to each person is a lot more likely to have their own philosophical thoughts and revolutions, and have that develop their higher functioning part of their brain a lot more. So I'm trying to figure out which way it's going to go, which way we think it's going to go based on what history tells us, what philosophers tell us. I have no idea.
Well, neither do I.
So put a pin
Uh,
in that.
maybe we should leave it there.
We can leave it there. Um, just quickly then,
Okay.
before we'll put a pin in that, and we'll finish up very shortly. Please tell me a little bit more about your book for everybody who hasn't heard it or hasn't read it already or hasn't seen it already.
The Nietzsche book, or
Yes.
sorry, yeah.
Contradiction.
Um, I'm sorry.
You say it was contradiction, did you say?
The book on Nietzsche, is that the one you're asking about?
Your most recent work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's Nietzsche.
Yeah. Yes.
It's Cambridge University Press. It's called Nietzsche on Virtue. Um, it's a short book. It's just over 30,000 words. And the basic idea is that Nietzsche is unusual among philosophers in that he thinks of virtues as developments of drives as opposed to acquired habits. So if you look, for instance, at Aristotle, he'll tell you what is a virtue. Well, it's an acquired disposition that is developed through habituation by practice. Nietzsche thinks instead that rather people are sort of disposed to do certain kinds of things, and if those dispositions just get shaped in the right way, they become virtues. And importantly for him, what counts as a virtue for you might be a vice for me. So if I've got certain drives, then maybe for me, curiosity is a virtue.
Mm.
But for someone else, curiosity might be a vice. Um, Likewise with courage, he's especially interested in intellectual courage. Likewise with this virtue that we talked about earlier, solitude. So he thinks it's not for everybody. It's only for people who are sort of a bit disagreeable, because if you're constantly criticizing your in-group, then you're not going to be well liked. And some people are just not constitutionally capable of handling that. Um, he also thinks that having a good sense of humor is a virtue. Um, and that's an interesting one because philosophers have written about jokes, but the, the disposition of someone who has a good sense of humor, who both knows what to laugh at and can make others laugh at the right things, is something that hasn't really received a lot of attention. And Nietzsche is interesting in this regard. He's also very funny himself. I don't know if you've had a chance to read like Beyond Good and Evil, for instance, but it's actually quite funny, um, despite being serious. So the book is essentially an exploration of what Nietzsche thinks virtues are and which ones he thinks are especially valuable, at least for people of his type. And this is where the anti-Procrustean thing comes in, because he thinks, yeah, okay, I mean, for me, curiosity is a virtue. For me, solitude is a virtue, but for you, maybe not. So the idea is that they come in kind of constellations that are matched to the person's existing drives.
Mm. Those existing drives being predominantly cultural, would you say?
Um,
Where they are and
well,
immediate
he
societies and
distinguishes
families.
between yeah, he distinguishes between drives and instincts. So for him, instincts are innate. So that would be biological. He he was writing before that people fully understood genetics. So he had a kind of Lamarckian understanding of how traits were passed down. But for him, some drives are instincts; these are biological, and then some drives are culturally acquired.
Mm. Awesome. And where can people get it? Where can they see it? Where can they read it?
Um, it's uh, it's available via Cambridge University Press as a paperback, um, and uh, it's probably also on LibGen. I don't know if your viewers are familiar with LibGen, Library Genesis. It's a website where you can illegally download PDFs of books for free.
They won't be happy with that one. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Mark. We'll leave it there, and I'd love to catch up with you for a coffee and flesh some things out, and hopefully have you on again sometime.